The summer sun over Sydney in the mid-1960s carried a sense of freedom that, to many families, felt almost innocent. The beaches were alive with children shouting, waves folding and unfolding across warm sand, and the soft hum of holiday laughter drifting across the coastline. On the morning of Monday, the 11th of January, in the year 1965, a group of siblings stepped off a train at Cronulla, excited for what should have been just another day at Wanda Beach. That day was supposed to be simple. It was supposed to be carefree. But what unfolded on that stretch of sand would echo across generations, becoming one of Australia's most haunting unsolved tragedies. Marianne Schmidt, 15 years old, was the oldest girl in a bustling German-Australian family. After their father died unexpectedly less than a year earlier, she stepped naturally into a role that no teenager should ever have to carry. She cooked meals, sorted school clothes, soothed crying younger siblings, and helped her mother manage the chaos of raising 7 children alone. Those who knew her often described her as calm, dependable, and far more mature than her age suggested. She was the sort of girl who placed everyone else first, who would wake early to help her mother before thinking about herself, and who took her responsibilities as though they were obligations etched into her bones. Her best friend, Christine Sherrock, also 15, had a different kind of energy, quiet at times, but filled with humor when she was comfortable. Together, the two girls balanced each other. Marianne brought steadiness. Christine brought spark. Their friendship grew naturally, strengthened not only by similar ages and proximity but by the kind of unspoken trust that teenage girls weave between themselves. They were inseparable in school corridors, in local shops, and walking through the neighborhood streets of Ryde. And on that warm January day, they were inseparable once again. They were neighbors, friends, and for that afternoon, the responsible guardians of the younger Schmidt children who needed a bit of summer fun to shake off the grief that still clung to their home. The train ride to Cronulla felt long to the younger siblings. Peter, just 10 years old, and his brothers and sisters clustered around him, but to Marianne and Christine, it offered a hint of freedom. Maybe, for the first time in months, they could breathe without the weight of household obligations pressing on them. They could run, laugh, and be teenagers rather than caretakers. Their swimsuits were tucked under their clothes, their towels slung over their arms, and the children under their supervision marched eagerly behind them. The day was theirs. When they arrived at Wanda Beach, the wind carried a strange mix of promise and disruption. The morning air was warm but restless. Sand whipped across the shoreline. Umbrellas shuddered and flapped. Waves rolled unpredictably, swelling with an unusual intensity that unsettled even experienced swimmers. But to a group of children after a long summer, even imperfect weather felt like a chance to escape. They spread their towels across the sand, unpacked snacks, and took shelter in the dunes when the wind grew sharper. At first, everything felt normal. The younger children dug shallow trenches in the sand, chased each other back and forth, and complained about the gusts that kept blowing grit into their eyes. Marianne and Christine tried to keep things light, offering amused glances at the younger one's antics, but the weather was slowly shifting from inconvenient to unpleasant. What struck Peter, years later, was how suddenly his sister and Christine's behavior changed. One moment they were sitting near the children, adjusting towels, trying to block the wind. The next moment, they seemed distracted, almost radiant, with an energy that didn't match the chaos of the weather. They kept glancing down the beach, whispering, then giggling in a way Peter described as unusual for them. These were not carefree, impulsive girls. They were responsible, serious, mature beyond their years. Yet something that afternoon pulled them briefly into the world of 15-year-old excitement. When Peter asked where they were going, they wrapped towels snugly around the younger siblings and told him they would be back soon. Then they giggled again, an odd, almost breathless kind of laughter, and began walking quickly down the beach, their hair whipping behind them, Christine slightly ahead, Marianne following. Peter remembered thinking that they were acting almost like they'd seen something that delighted or intrigued them, something unexpected. Witnesses later came forward saying they had seen the girls near the dunes with a teenage boy, described only as a youth around 16 years old. No one knew his name. No one came forward claiming to know him. He walked between them, or slightly behind them, and the trio were seen moving deeper into the dunes. To adults on the beach, it didn't look alarming at the time. Teenagers wandered off together all the time. No one imagined danger lurking in plain sight. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the wind only grew stronger. Sand began moving like a pale haze across the beach, thin sheets of gritty particles skimming across the ground. The younger children huddled together, increasingly uncomfortable, trying to shake sand out of their hair and wipe the stinging grains from their eyes. Peter kept expecting his sister to return, calling their names through the wind, but she never did. The sky shifted toward gray. The sun dimmed behind thick clouds, and then the fear began to creep in. Peter, only 10 years old, yet suddenly the oldest child present, understood the sinking realization that they had been left too long. He glanced down the long stretch of beach, saw only distant silhouettes, none resembling his sister. He gathered his younger siblings to leave. It was a decision far too heavy for a child his age. But he made it with remarkable composure, something that would stay with him for decades. They boarded the train back home, the miles passing with an uneasy tension. 5 children walked through their front door, but the 2 teenagers who had promised to return soon never came home. That night, worry turned to dread. Their mother, unable to bear the uncertainty, reported them missing. Across Sydney, a deep unease took hold. 2 responsible teenage girls simply vanished from a crowded beach on a windy summer afternoon. The police launched one of the largest searches New South Wales had ever conducted. Officers combed the dunes. Locals joined in. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through long grasses and shifting sands. But at sundown, nothing was found. It was the following day, partway down the beach, that a young man and his nephews stumbled upon a shallow depression in the sand. At first they thought it was nothing more than a disturbed patch caused by the stormy winds. But the closer they got, the more they realized something was terribly wrong. There, partially concealed beneath layers of drifted sand, lay the bodies of Marianne and Christine. News spread like wildfire across Australia. Radios buzzed with bulletins. Newspapers printed extra editions. People across Sydney struggled to comprehend how 2 teenage girls could be taken and killed in broad daylight with no one noticing anything clearly suspicious. The innocence of the era ruptured in an instant. Parents clutched their children tighter. Beaches that once felt like paradises suddenly seemed dangerous, unpredictable, and shadowed by a threat that no one had seen coming. The scene at Wanda Beach stunned investigators. What happened in those dunes was clearly violent, yet police were careful with their language publicly, aware of the shock rippling through the nation. Behind closed doors, they understood the magnitude of the case. Whoever had done this acted swiftly, confidently, and vanished without leaving a clear trail behind. It felt almost as though a ghost had moved through the dunes, visible one moment, unseen the next. Detectives worked tirelessly. They interviewed countless witnesses, some who thought they saw the girls heading down the beach, others who believed they saw someone following them. But facts dissolved into fog. Memories clashed. Descriptions blurred. Some leads seemed promising, only to fade. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Each passing day widened the gap between the present and the last moments of Marianne and Christine's lives. The girls' families were left not only with heartbreak, but with a haunting absence of understanding. They wanted answers, needed them, yet every attempt to reconstruct the teenagers' final steps seemed to collapse under the weight of uncertainty. Why did they walk away so suddenly? Who was the boy witnesses mentioned? What had drawn them into the dunes on a windy day when most people sought shelter? The gaps in the story became a tormenting labyrinth. As years passed, detectives continued revisiting the case. Boxes of statements, clothing, and forensic samples remained stored deep within police archives. Investigators believed the perpetrator was almost certainly a male predator, someone opportunistic, someone who acted quickly. Yet, without physical evidence linking a suspect to the scene, no arrest could be made. Australia changed across the decades, but the memory of the Wanda Beach murders never faded. For many, it marked the end of an era of trust, the moment when families realized that even a crowded beach on a bright summer afternoon could harbor hidden dangers. The case became one of the most discussed unsolved crimes in the nation's history, inspiring documentaries, theories, and investigative reopenings, each one hoping to uncover something missed before. As for the Schmidt family, the grief never loosened its grip. Marianne's younger siblings grew older, but their memories of that windy afternoon remained etched in their minds. The giggling they witnessed, the strange excitement in the girls' behavior, the final glimpse of their sister walking down the beach, each detail became a permanent fragment of trauma. And Peter, who once sat trembling with younger siblings huddled around him as the sky darkened, carried a burden no child should ever have to endure. That he was the one who led them away, not knowing his sister would never return. Before we continue, a gentle reminder from Darkcasedesk. If you find value in these deep dive investigations into forgotten or unsolved cases, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps keep stories like Marianne and Christine's alive and ensures these victims are never forgotten. This marks the beginning of our journey into one of Australia's most unsettling and long-lasting mysteries. The story is far from over, and the search for truth winds through decades of leads, suspects, silence, and heartbreak. When you're ready, we'll continue deeper into the haunting timeline of the Wanda Beach tragedy, exploring the investigative twists, the chilling suspect connections, and the enduring call for justice. The days that followed the discovery of Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sherrock's bodies were a blur of confusion, grief, and frantic police work. It was as if an entire city held its breath, trying to understand how such a loss could happen in a place so public, so familiar. The summer heat lingered over Sydney, but a chill settled through the community, one that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the realization that someone capable of a terrible act had walked among them. The Schmidt home was filled with silence. The younger children did not understand the full extent of what had happened, only that their sister would not be returning. Their mother, devastated beyond measure, tried to hold herself together for the sake of her remaining children. But the grief was raw and overwhelming. Marianne had been her right hand, her support, her eldest daughter. In a home without a father, she had become a second parent. Now the house felt like it had an empty center, as if the world had shifted a few degrees off balance. Christine's family suffered in much the same way. Two households, once connected by the friendship of their daughters, now shared a grief that felt impossible to articulate. There were no answers to offer, no explanations that could soften the blow. The only thing families could cling to was the hope that the police inquiry would bring clarity. They hoped for justice. They hoped for understanding. They hoped anything that resembled closure. Investigators combed through the dunes, with the determination of people who refused to let a killer slip through their fingers. But the scene had been exposed to the elements for hours before discovery. The wind that had made the afternoon so unpleasant also scattered clues, blowing sand across footprints, smudging impressions, and making the work far harder than it might have been. Whatever tracks were left were inconsistent. The area was heavily trafficked by locals and holidaygoers. Stray footprints crisscrossed the dunes. Beach towels, discarded rubbish, cigarette butts. It was impossible to distinguish what belonged to the crime scene and what belonged to the ordinary chaos of summertime. The police interviewed hundreds of witnesses. Some remembered seeing 3 teenagers walking along the beach. Some thought they saw a boy. Others recalled nothing out of the ordinary. The statements were tangled, contradicting each other, and many were vague. The wind had been loud. The sand had been moving. People hurriedly packed up and left because of the discomfort. Even those who were there struggled to recall precise details. It was a jigsaw puzzle with too many missing pieces. One of the earliest and strongest theories investigators formed was that the girls were approached by someone who seemed friendly or familiar, someone who did not appear threatening. Witnesses repeatedly mentioned a youth around 16 years old, though no one could confidently recognize him. That detail became the cornerstone of early speculation. The girls had left with a male around their age. But who he was remained a mystery that would taunt investigators for decades. In the mid-1960s, Australian police forces did not have the forensic capabilities available today. DNA testing did not exist. Trace evidence analysis was far more limited. Detectives relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, behavioral profiling, and physical clues found at the scene. Despite their efforts, the investigation reached a frustrating standstill. Every promising lead dissolved when examined closely. Theories sprouted, with some members of the public becoming convinced they had seen something important, while others speculated wildly, spreading rumors that only intensified the pressure on investigators. The media followed the story obsessively. Headlines filled newspapers. Radios broadcast updates. People gathered in living rooms discussing theories and suspects, their voices low, as if afraid the killer might be listening. There was a sense of collective vulnerability. An unsettling awareness that the person responsible had slipped away unseen. This crime had occurred not in a secluded alley, not in a remote area, but on a beach packed with families, and that alone terrified the nation. Meanwhile, back in the Schmidt home, everyday life felt unbearable. The children struggled to sleep. Their mother, already grieving the loss of her husband the previous year, now faced the unimaginable pain of losing a daughter. And for young Peter, the memories of that day became a constant torment. He replayed the events in his mind over and over, wondering if he had missed something, if he should have followed them, if anything he might have done could have changed the outcome. But he was a child, burdened with responsibilities he was never meant to carry. No one blamed him. But the weight stayed. Police revisited the scene again and again, searching for something, anything that might have been overlooked. They compiled lists of known offenders. They spoke with local teens. They explored the possibility that the girls had encountered a stranger. They also pursued the idea that someone familiar, someone who frequented the beach, may have been responsible. In the early months of the investigation, numerous persons of interest were named, but none could be linked conclusively. Some individuals provided alibis, others had no connection to the girls. A few seemed suspicious at first glance, but were later dismissed after deeper investigation. The lack of concrete evidence was the greatest enemy. Even if police felt strongly about a suspect, the absence of physical proof made it impossible to arrest or charge anyone. Yet the case refused to fade. It haunted investigators long after they clocked out for the day. Many officers kept files on their desks longer than required, feeling a personal obligation to the two 15-year-old girls who had been robbed of their futures. Those who later worked on the case in cold case divisions described feeling as though the investigation itself demanded attention, as though it pulled them back time and time again. But the years kept passing. Sydney changed. Wanda Beach changed. The surf clubs modernized, the dunes shifted, pathways were built, old memories faded, and new families visited the sands without knowing the weight of what had once happened there. Yet every so often, someone would mention the tragedy, and an old wound would open again. People remembered the newspapers, they remembered the panic, they remembered the sudden shift in public trust. By the mid-1960s, as the investigation dragged on, another unsettling detail emerged: the sharp shift in the girls' behavior just before they left the younger children behind. Witnesses said they were giggling, excited, acting out of character. At first, this had been interpreted as simply teenage girls noticing someone interesting. But as time went on, investigators wondered whether the girls had been manipulated, approached by someone charismatic or charming enough to make them lower their guard. The idea that their behavior had been influenced, perhaps deliberately, began to take hold. This was a period in Australia when discussions about predators, manipulation, or grooming were not part of everyday conversation. Society's understanding of such dangers was limited. The notion that someone could charm, distract, or lure young people was not widely recognized. And yet, in the context of what happened that day, such a possibility became harder to ignore. Throughout the late 1960s, detectives continued working through tip-offs. Some were credible, some were desperate. Some were fantasies created by individuals who wanted attention or to play a role in a high-profile investigation. Sorting truth from fiction took time and resources. Every call had to be documented. Every potential lead required evaluation. And then, in the year 1969, something surfaced that would later become one of the strongest investigative threads in the case. A young man, originally from the area, a person who had lived near the girls, was named as a potential suspect by someone who knew him personally. The information came from someone close to him who expressed concerns about his behavior. In an era without digital records, communication between police departments was slower. The lead was not acted upon as quickly as it should have been, something regretted for decades afterward. By the time investigators attempted to delve deeper, the individual had left the country. But in the context of this narrative, we will not focus on graphic details or identify individuals in ways that violate monetization rules. We simply note the frustration investigators felt when a potentially critical opportunity slipped away. Despite this, the Wanda Beach investigation continued to evolve. Every few years, new detectives picked up the file, reviewed statements, and attempted to connect dots that previously seemed unconnectable. Some believed strongly in certain suspects. Others felt compelled by alternative theories. There were debates, discussions, disagreements, and moments of optimism, followed by sinking disappointment. One of the most emotional challenges for investigators was working with the families. How do you speak to a mother who has lost her daughter? How do you comfort siblings who spent their entire lives grappling with unanswered questions? Detectives found themselves not only pursuing justice, but also managing the emotional weight carried by everyone touched by the incident. Children who had once been the younger siblings that Marianne protected grew into adults who never let go of the desire for answers. The public continued to care deeply about the case, particularly because it symbolized something larger: the sudden, devastating loss of innocence in a country that once felt sheltered from such horrors. As the decades unfolded, Australia entered a new era of forensic science. DNA technology emerged. Cold cases across the world were reopened. Crimes previously thought unsolvable suddenly had solutions. Serial offenders were caught. Long-forgotten tragedies received renewed attention. Communities found closure through breakthroughs that would have been impossible years earlier. And so, hope returned to the Wanda Beach case as well. The clothing the girls wore that day, carefully stored in police archives, remained intact. Investigators believed that within the fibers, there might still be microscopic traces waiting to be uncovered. Every so often, forensic teams re-evaluated the viability of the evidence, wondering whether technological advancements might finally reveal something hidden for decades. The idea of recovering even a fragment of genetic material gave the families hope. Police held on to that hope too, aware that in many other cases around the world, forensic miracles had occurred. As we continue this investigation, remember that preserving these stories matters. Sharing them ensures that victims like Marianne and Christine are not forgotten, and with today's technology, there is always a chance, no matter how small, that an old clue may finally speak. If you're finding value in this deep exploration, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Dark Case Desk. It helps keep these stories alive and supports ongoing coverage of cases the world should never forget. The years that followed the Wanda Beach murders were shaped by a mixture of frustration, lingering fear, and the stubborn determination of investigators who refused to give up on Marianne and Christine. Even as Australia moved through enormous cultural changes, new music, new freedoms, new cities, rising along new skylines, the memory of what happened in January of 1965 remained an unhealed wound in the national consciousness. It was the kind of case that became a reference point in conversations, a chilling reminder that even the most ordinary days could turn into something unspeakably tragic. For the families, life had to continue, but nothing ever returned to what it had been. The Schmidt home, once filled with the energy of 7 children running in and out of rooms, now carried a heaviness that did not go away. A mother already grieving the loss of her husband found herself navigating another kind of heartbreak, one that left her searching for something she could never fully grasp: understanding. For the Sherrock family, grief came not only from the loss of their daughter, but from the overwhelming sense that the world suddenly felt unpredictable and unsafe. Both families struggled to keep moving forward, their routines forever altered. While the families grieved, the police continued working through an investigation that, even early on, felt like it was slipping further out of reach. The wind that day had been both witness and enemy. It erased footprints, scattered grains of sand across key areas, and destroyed fragile evidence. With every gust, nature worked against the detectives. Even now, decades later, many investigators cite the harsh environmental conditions as one of the biggest obstacles in the case. Still, detectives refused to let the trail grow cold easily. They interviewed beachgoers, lifeguards, local teenagers, shop owners, and anyone who had been within several kilometers of Wanda Beach that afternoon. They visited train stations, hoping someone might remember seeing the group earlier in the day. They collected statements from countless individuals, filling boxes with reports, some useful, others not. What they desperately needed was clarity. But clarity is difficult to find when the truth is buried beneath shifting sands and fractured memories. One of the most haunting elements of the case was the girls' behavior before they disappeared. Their sudden shift from responsible caretakers to excited, giggling teenagers never stopped troubling investigators. Witnesses described them laughing, acting strangely giddy, almost as if they had seen something that drew them forward. This behavioral change became, over time, one of the mystery's most maddening clues. Some investigators believed the girls may have encountered someone familiar. Others argued the opposite, that they met someone new, someone who made them feel at ease through charm or confidence. Another possibility, one discussed in quieter corners of investigative rooms, was that teenage curiosity or infatuation may have played a part. In the innocence of the mid-1960s, young people were less attuned to potential dangers. If someone slightly older, confident, or charismatic approached them, it might have seemed harmless rather than alarming. Witness accounts describing a boy around 16 years old were taken seriously, but the descriptions varied too widely to establish identity. Some said the boy walked closely beside them, others said he lingered behind. Some described dark hair, others claimed it was light. And because Wanda Beach was crowded that day, the number of teenagers present made identifying one particular youth almost impossible. Just as frustrating was the fact that no one ever came forward to say they knew him. Not a single classmate, neighbor, or acquaintance recognized the description strongly enough to report it. As days passed and leads became scarce, police faced mounting public pressure. Newspapers printed bold headlines, and the story took on a national significance. People across Australia felt personally invested in the search for answers. Mothers who had once allowed their children to roam freely now found themselves scanning beaches nervously. Fathers who once believed their communities were safe now looked over their shoulders when walking home from evening work. The entire country experienced a shift in awareness. Detectives revisited the crime scene repeatedly, searching for something they might have missed during the initial investigation. But summer sands are ever-changing, reshaped by wind, footsteps, and natural movement. Each week, the dunes looked different. Each day erased a bit more of the past. The feeling that the crime scene itself was evaporating added to the investigators' urgency and despair. During this time, police also produced a series of sketches based on the descriptions provided by witnesses. These sketches, depicting the unidentified youth, were circulated in newspapers. They were posted at surf clubs and cafes, given to schools, and distributed at nearby train stations. But again, nothing. No solid identification. Not even a rumor strong enough to pursue with confidence. The youth in the sketches became a ghost, someone who appeared in the story for a fleeting moment before dissolving back into the countless faces of people who passed through Wanda Beach. As months turned into years, the investigation grew more complex. New potential suspects emerged. Some were local, some were travelers. Some were people who had left the area around the time of the murders. But in every instance, one critical piece was missing: evidence. Without forensic technology, without clear eyewitness identification, and without a confession, investigators could not confidently connect any individual to the tragedy. Meanwhile, the emotional burden on the younger Schmidt siblings deepened. Peter, who had been only 10 when he led his younger brothers and sisters off the beach, grew up carrying the memory like a weight strapped to his chest. He later spoke about how he had replayed that day in his mind thousands of times. He wondered whether he should have followed them, whether he should have asked more questions, but he had done everything right, everything a child could reasonably do. Still, that did not stop him from feeling responsible in ways that no child should. Christine's family, too, struggled in silence. Grief has a way of isolating people, and the Sherrick household faced a storm of their own. Parents grappled with guilt, irrational as it was. Siblings sometimes avoided discussing the tragedy altogether, fearing that doing so would reopen wounds too painful to bear. The grief was shared, but the way each family member experienced it was deeply personal. In the years that followed, the Wanda Beach case became a defining moment for Australia's understanding of criminal investigations, particularly those involving young victims. It sparked conversations about child safety, about the vulnerabilities of everyday life, and about the urgent need for improved forensic techniques. As the 1970s arrived, advances in policing began shaping new investigative possibilities. But even with these advances, the Wanda Beach case remained elusive. It was during the late 1960s and early 1970s that more structured cold case review methods began emerging in Australia, though the concept was still in its infancy. In the following decades, several detectives from different eras would pick up the Wanda Beach file, each hoping to see something their predecessors missed. They read through transcripts, re-evaluated interviews, and studied the terrain around the beach. They created timelines, reconstructed potential routes the girls might have taken, and analyzed known offenders in the region. One chilling aspect of many unsolved cases is the possibility that the perpetrator simply blended back into daily life. In the Wanda Beach case, investigators believed that whoever committed the crime likely did not vanish into thin air. The odds were high that the individual returned to their routine, went home, greeted family members, and carried on as though nothing had happened. The idea that someone capable of such violence could continue living unnoticed sent chills through the community. What particularly troubled detectives was the level of confidence exhibited by the killer. The act took place in daylight, on a crowded beach, in a location with multiple vantage points. For someone to commit such a crime under those circumstances suggested not recklessness, but a chilling boldness. Whoever did it either believed they wouldn't be caught or simply did not care. Both possibilities were equally disturbing. By the time the 1980s arrived, the Wanda Beach murders had taken on a mythical quality in Australian crime history. They were discussed in true crime articles, studied in criminology courses, and referenced in media as one of the nation's darkest mysteries. But for the families, these discussions offered little comfort. They did not want notoriety. They wanted resolution. The enduring question that haunted investigators was simple. What exactly pulled the girls away that day? Was it someone they trusted? Someone they found appealing? Someone they thought could offer something exciting or interesting? Or was it fear? The details available to detectives created a story that seemed both familiar and unknowable. Over time, investigators began to reconsider early witness statements more intensely. The girls had reportedly said, "We're going mad," before leaving the younger children huddled beneath their towels. That phrase, ambiguous and odd, became one of the case's most cryptic clues. Did they mean they were excited, nervous, thrilled? Did it refer to a joke? To a plan? The phrase alone could be interpreted dozens of ways. Some cold case analysts believed the phrase indicated spontaneity. Perhaps they had spotted something or someone interesting, prompting them to leave. Others believed the phrase was meant to reassure their siblings, making light of their sudden departure. But without the girls themselves, the true meaning remained out of reach. For the next several decades, the Wanda Beach case remained open, though progress was intermittent. Every so often, a new piece of information would surface, pulling investigators back toward the possibility of a breakthrough. Yet each time, hopes rose only to fall again. The crime was now becoming a generational mystery, slipping further away, yet never entirely forgotten. The greatest hope for resolution emerged with the dawn of modern forensic science. Advances in DNA profiling, touch DNA collection, and microscopic trace analysis offered possibilities unimaginable in the 1960s. Investigators began to examine the clothing worn by Marianne and Christine with a new level of scientific precision. Deep within the fibers, there might exist genetic material invisible to the human eye, tiny, fragile clues preserved by luck or circumstance. The families waited. Investigators waited. The public watched with quiet anticipation, aware that the answers, if they existed at all, might still be hidden inside those decades-old garments. Before we move to the next stage of this story toward the forensic era, the cold case breakthroughs, and the psychological landscape of the investigation, a brief reminder from Darkcasedesk. If you value these in-depth explorations into real cases, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. It helps the channel grow and ensures that stories like Marianne and Christine's are never forgotten. As Australia entered the final decades of the 20th century, the Wanda Beach murders continued to sit in the collective memory like a shadow cast over an otherwise bright seaside landscape. Every summer, families returned to the sand and surf, laughing, swimming, sunbathing, but beneath it all lingered a silent question, one that had never been resolved. What truly happened to Marianne and Christine in those dunes on that windy January afternoon? Time has a way of reshaping memory, softening some edges while sharpening others. For the families, however, nothing softened. The passage of time did not ease grief, it simply rearranged it. The sorrow that once felt sharp and overwhelming eventually settled deeper into their bones, becoming part of their identity, part of the way they moved through the world. The Schmidt children grew up carrying the story with them everywhere they went. Marianne remained the older sister, frozen in time, 15 years old forever, while they aged beyond her, lived through decades she never saw, and experienced milestones she never reached. For the Sherrock family, the pain was equally enduring. Christine, once full of potential and quiet brilliance, never had the chance to become who she might have grown into. Her parents lived with the ache of unanswered questions, and her siblings survived with the knowledge that their family had been forever divided between before and after. Grief does not follow a straight path. It bends, loops, occasionally disappears, only to resurface unexpectedly, an emotional undertow that pulls people back to moments they wish they could forget, but cannot. In the broader community, the murder of the two 15-year-old girls changed habits, conversations, and culture. Parents who once allowed their children a wide degree of freedom now kept a closer watch. Beaches, for all their beauty, were no longer seen through the same idealistic lens. People asked questions about safety, visibility, and vulnerability. The tragedy created a shift in awareness, a national wake-up call that innocence alone is not protection. Meanwhile, the police continued their efforts. The original detectives who had worked tirelessly in 1965 eventually moved on or retired, leaving behind a case that many felt they had carried like a personal burden. But new detectives inherited the file over the years. Some were drawn to it by professional curiosity, others by the haunting nature of the case itself. It became one of Australia's longest-running mysteries, a symbol of the challenges faced by law enforcement during a time before modern forensic techniques existed. As the decades passed, investigators continued to review the boxes of evidence stored in New South Wales police archives. There were more than 50 boxes filled with handwritten statements, typed reports, sketches, diagrams, maps, and photographs. These were the remnants of the original investigation, preserved meticulously so future officers could return to the case with fresh eyes and new technology. But even with careful preservation, time affects evidence. Fibers degrade, paper yellows, dust settles. And yet, inside those boxes remained the girls' clothing items kept in the hope that one day scientific advancements might extract clues invisible to investigators in the 1960s. Throughout the 70s and 80s, the Wanda Beach case was referenced frequently in discussions about criminal profiling, predator behavior, and unsolved mysteries. As Australia grew more aware of offenders who targeted young people, theorists began exploring new interpretations of the girls' final moments. Some criminologists speculated that the sudden excitement the girls displayed suggested someone charismatic had approached them. Others believed the behavior was a mask, a nervous reaction to someone whose intentions they sensed but could not fully articulate. The problem with the case was not a shortage of theories. It was the absence of evidence strong enough to validate any of them. Over the years, people speculated about local youths, passing strangers, and even individuals connected to other unrelated crimes. Some theories were grounded in logic, others bordered on conjecture. But because the investigation lacked definitive proof, each new theory remained just that, a theory. By the late 1970s, cold case methodology had advanced significantly. Police across the world were beginning to revisit older cases with renewed determination. New interview strategies were being taught, and offender profiling, then an emerging discipline, added a psychological layer to investigations. But even with these new tools, the Wanda Beach case resisted resolution. The evidence was simply too fragile, too compromised by the elements, and too impacted by the era in which it occurred. In the 1980s, the emergence of DNA profiling revolutionized the world of forensic science. Suddenly, cases once thought impossible to solve could be reopened, analyzed, and re-examined through a completely different lens. For many victims and their families, DNA breakthroughs offered long-awaited answers. Cold case units across the globe began combing through old evidence, hoping for miracles. For the Wanda Beach case, hope surged again. The girls' clothing, kept sealed, preserved, and untouched for decades, became the focus of new scientific attention. Investigators wondered whether forensic scientists might extract microscopic traces of DNA, skin cells, or other biological material from the fibers. Even the tiniest fragment could provide a lead. The potential was monumental, but the outcome remained uncertain. Old evidence does not always hold enough genetic material. Environmental conditions from decades earlier often degrade what might have once been present. Still, the possibility of extracting DNA motivated investigators. Specialists began to evaluate whether the clothing could be tested using modern techniques. It was painstaking, meticulous work. And though details remain confidential, one thing is clear: the door was not yet closed. Even after decades, the case remained active in principle, resting, but not forgotten. One of the most profound aspects of cold case investigations is the emotional connection detectives often form with the victims. Many officers who later took on the Wanda Beach file described feeling a deep sense of responsibility, even though they had not been alive when the tragedy occurred. Marianne and Christine felt almost like daughters, younger sisters, or members of the community whose stories demanded answers. The duty to find truth transcended time. This emotional bond drove investigators to track new leads whenever they emerged. Every few years, someone would call police, claiming to have remembered something new. Perhaps they had crossed paths with a suspicious individual on the beach that day. Perhaps they had heard rumors. Perhaps they believed they had seen something important. These calls were taken seriously not because they always had merit, but because the possibility of truth lingered in every corner. During the 90s and early 2000s, true crime documentaries gained global popularity. Many of these productions revisited the Wanda Beach case, offering renewed public interest and occasionally prompting witnesses to come forward with information. Though none of these new details resulted in definitive breakthroughs, they contributed pieces to a puzzle that investigators still hope to solve. Even now, long after the tragedy, many Australians recall hearing about the Wanda Beach murders as children or teenagers. The case became a warning, told across generations, parents warning their children to stay together, to trust their instincts, to be aware of their surroundings. It became part of the cultural fabric, shaping the way Australians talk about safety, vulnerability, and public spaces. Throughout all of this, one detail from the original investigation continued to sit at the heart of the mystery: the girls' final walk into the dunes. What happened in those last minutes? Why did they leave the younger children so abruptly? What did they see? Did they willingly follow someone? Were they afraid? Were they curious? Were they deceived? Decades later, these questions still echo unanswered, forming the emotional backbone of the entire case. For investigators, reconstructing the girls' final movements is like trying to map a road that has long since been washed away by the tide. Only fragments remain: scattered impressions, witness statements, and behavioral clues that may or may not reflect what truly happened. As we move deeper into this narrative, exploring the modern era of the investigation, the cold case analysis, and the detective theories shaped by evolving forensic science, it becomes increasingly clear that the Wanda Beach case is not only a story of tragedy, but also a story of persistence. For nearly 6 decades, people have refused to let the memory fade. The girls' names remain spoken, their faces remembered, their story retold countless times. Before we move to the next phase of the documentary, a gentle reminder from Darkcasedesk. If you appreciate these deep explorations into real cases and want to help keep these stories alive, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support ensures that victims like Marianne and Christine are never moved into the shadows of forgotten history. By the time Australia stepped into the 21st century, technological breakthroughs in investigation were opening doors that had remained sealed for generations. Cold cases long thought unsolvable were suddenly becoming solvable again. Families that had waited decades for answers were finally seeing justice. And through all of this, the Wanda Beach murders remained one of the most anticipated cases for potential scientific resolution. But before those later developments can be understood, we must go back into the emotional and investigative journey that defined the decades following the tragedy, because the Wanda Beach murders did not simply sit dormant. The case lived, breathed, and resurfaced again and again, shaped by the growing determination of investigators and the persistent memory of a nation still haunted by 2 15-year-old girls whose futures had been stolen. For many Australians, Wanda Beach was more than a location. It was a place tied to childhood memories, family weekends, picnics, and surf culture. Even after the tragedy, thousands continued to visit, but the story lingered beneath the surface like an undertow, unseen but never absent. Parents pointed toward the dunes with a warning, teenagers whispered about what had happened, and adults who lived through the 1960s carried the memory like a scar, never quite healing, never fully fading. Behind the scenes, the New South Wales police force was undergoing its own transformation. The structure of cold case investigations became more formalized, and specialized units began taking on cases from previous decades. This shift allowed long-forgotten files to be reopened, reviewed, and re-evaluated with fresh eyes. And among the most important of these files was the Wanda Beach case. Detectives in later generations spoke openly about the weight of inheriting such a file. Opening the first box alone could feel overwhelming. Hundreds of pages, handwritten notes, evidence logs, diagrams of the dunes, interviews with witnesses who were now elderly or deceased. The sheer volume reflected how intensely the original investigators had worked. It also revealed how deeply the case had gripped Sydney in the months and years following the murders. One particular challenge faced by cold case detectives was the reliance on statements taken at the time. In 1965, witness interviews were conducted using techniques very different from today's methods. People were not prompted with cognitive memory retrieval strategies. Their recollections were recorded in longhand, often with incomplete details. Many witnesses were teenagers themselves, and their memories were shaped by the confusion and chaos of a windy afternoon. With the passing of decades, re-interviewing those witnesses presented new challenges. Memories fade, people relocate, and some information becomes blurred by time. Still, detectives persisted. They went through every line of every old statement, searching for inconsistencies or overlooked details. Sometimes, a tiny note scribbled in the margin became meaningful. Sometimes, a misspelled name turned out to lead to a potential witness who had never been fully traced. Sometimes, a timeline that once seemed rigid became flexible when interpreted through modern investigative knowledge. It was meticulous work, and much of it felt like chasing ghosts, but the effort continued. During the 1990s and early 2000s, investigators developed new theories based on behavioral profiling. Profiling, once considered more art than science, had matured into a discipline backed by psychology, criminology, and case studies from across the world. Offenders who attacked during daytime, on public beaches, and who displayed confidence were placed into specific behavioral categories. Analysts began examining the Wanda Beach offender through this lens, building psychological portraits of the type of person who could have approached the girls in broad daylight. This approach led to several working theories. One possibility was that the offender was a local teenager or someone familiar with the area. He might have frequented the beach, knew where the dunes offered concealment, and blended easily with the crowds. Another theory suggested the offender was a transient visitor, someone passing through the area, unknown to locals, and therefore harder to trace. Beaches attract people from all over Sydney and beyond, making it difficult to narrow down suspects who did not live nearby. A third theory explored the possibility of an opportunistic predator who may have been responsible for other attacks in or around the region. In the decades following 1965, several offenders in Australia had been linked to multiple crimes across various states. The possibility that Wanda Beach was connected to another series of events was not dismissed, though no definitive links were ever established. Despite these theories, the heart of the case continued to revolve around one enduring mystery. Who was the youth seen with the girls? This unidentified teenager became one of the most persistent figures in the case, a silhouette in witness descriptions, a ghost in sketches, a presence mentioned but never recognized. Investigators wanted him identified, not simply because he might have been involved, but because he might have held information crucial to understanding the girls' final movements. Even if he had nothing to do with the crime itself, he may have been the last person to see them alive. But the youth never came forward. No one ever admitted to being him. No credible lead ever identified him. And as decades passed, the chances of learning who he was grew increasingly slim. Yet the uncertainty did not stop investigators. They went through school records from the era, examined teenage groups known to frequent the beach, and mapped out social circles. But the truth, as always, remained elusive. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of reviewing cold case records is encountering moments where investigators came frustratingly close to potential breakthroughs. There were leads that could not be pursued fully due to jurisdictional delays, witnesses who could not be located in time, and suspects who left the country just as questions about them began to intensify. Some potential witnesses moved overseas, others died before they could be re-interviewed, some refused to speak at all. Cold case detectives often talk about the emotional toll of understanding that crucial windows of opportunity were missed, not because of negligence, but because the era simply lacked the communication systems we take for granted today. Phones were slower, records were handwritten, cooperation between states and countries was far more complex, and in 1965, international travel created investigative hurdles nearly impossible to overcome quickly. Still, hope persisted. In the early 2000s, advances in touch DNA, the ability to extract genetic material from items handled or worn decades earlier, generated a renewed sense of possibility. Scientists had developed methods capable of detecting microscopic traces left behind on fabric, even after years of storage. It was an extraordinary step forward, and one that cold case units around the world began leveraging immediately. The clothing worn by Marianne and Christine, still preserved carefully in evidence storage, became a focal point once again. Could a fragment of DNA be found? Could modern forensic tools succeed where earlier methods had failed? Specialists assessed the condition of the garments, examined the fibers under advanced microscopes, and planned extraction strategies designed to capture even the faintest trace. The challenge, however, was that decades of environmental exposure and storage conditions could degrade DNA. Sand, moisture, handling by investigators during the original investigation, and simply the passage of time might have erased everything. Forensic scientists approached the evidence with both hope and caution. Publicly, authorities expressed optimism. They noted that it was still possible, perhaps even likely, that some biological material remained. They spoke of technological progress, of breakthroughs in other decades-old cases, and of their determination to continue the fight. For the families, this was both comforting and painful. To live for decades with an unsolved tragedy means living with uncertainty. The possibility of answers brings hope, but hope itself can be exhausting. Still, both families expressed their desire for closure not out of anger alone, but out of love. They wanted to understand what had happened to the girls they had lost so many years ago. They wanted to know why. As we move into the next stage of this story, the investigative revival in the modern era, the revisiting of old suspects, and the continuing forensic analysis, it is important to remember why these cases must be told. Keeping victims' memories alive is not only an act of storytelling, it is an act of honor, of remembrance, and of respect. If you're finding value in this documentary-style narrative and want to support the channel, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps Darkcasedesk continue telling the stories that matter and ensures victims like Marianne and Christine are never forgotten. As the 21st century moved forward, the Wanda Beach murders became one of those haunting cold cases that seemed to live in two time periods at once. It existed firmly planted in the history of 1965, etched into the memory of a hot, windy Sydney afternoon when two teenage girls walked away laughing, and yet, at the same time, it remained painfully alive in the present, its unanswered questions pulsing through investigative rooms, police archives, and the hearts of the families who still wanted to know why their daughters never came home. Cold case detectives who inherited the file did not see it as an unsolvable mystery. They saw it as a promise that had never been fulfilled. It became a case that demanded respect. The file was more than paper. It was the last remaining voice of Marianne and Christine. And in that voice, there was always the possibility, no matter how small, that the truth was still waiting to be uncovered. Each detective who opened the Wanda Beach boxes felt the same sting of responsibility. The original lead investigators were long retired. Many had passed away, but their handwritten notes, their interview transcripts, their diagrams, and even their doubts remained. Cold case detectives found themselves reading these documents not just as evidence, but almost as conversations with their predecessors, conversations across generations of law enforcement, united by a shared determination to give the girls their justice. Among the most impactful items in the archives were the handwritten interview notes from the Schmidt children. Peter's recollections, the confusion of the younger siblings, the detail of the towels wrapped around them, the strange giggling from the girls before they walked away. These fragments carried a raw, familiar pain, even decades later. Cold case detectives read those childhood statements with a kind of reverence, knowing how much weight they carried. The case file also contained newspaper clippings from the 1960s, large, bold headlines from the Sydney press, grainy photographs of the dunes, interviews with locals, calls for witnesses, and editorial pieces urging readers to stay vigilant. Some articles were sensationalized products of the era's media style, but others were careful, sympathetic, and deeply concerned for the community. The archive offered a glimpse into how the case had overshadowed the city, how it had torn through the tranquility of the time, and how the public had reacted with fear and heartbreak. One of the most difficult challenges for modern investigators was reconstructing the movements of the girls from the beach to the dunes. Witness statements offered conflicting timelines. Some people believed they saw the girls walking with the unknown youth around midday. Others placed the interaction later in the afternoon. Some remembered seeing the girls near the surf with towels. Others recalled seeing them walking inland toward the dunes. The windstorm that afternoon added a layer of confusion. People were moving quickly, packing belongings, shielding themselves from flying sand. Many witnesses who later tried to help described the day as chaotic, hard to see, or too windy to recognize faces properly. Cold case detectives attempted to overlay these witness accounts onto aerial maps of Wanda Beach from the 1960s. They used geographical profiling techniques to determine where someone might have led the girls. They examined dune shapes, paths, secluded pockets, and sightlines. The dunes were far more open in those years, but still contained enough depth for someone with ill intentions to find concealment. This geographical reconstruction led some investigators to theorize that the offender had chosen the location deliberately, not impulsively. The site where the girls were found suggested someone familiar with the terrain, someone who knew where quick concealment was possible, someone who understood the natural curve of the dunes, and someone who believed they could commit a crime without drawing attention. While nothing can be stated with certainty, the idea that the offender was familiar with the area became one of the more enduring theories in later years. Another significant advancement in the modern cold case examination was the development of victimology, the study of victims' lives, personalities, routines, and behaviors. By understanding who the girls were, investigators hoped to gain insight into who might have approached them. Marianne was known for her responsibility, her maturity, and her cautious nature. Despite her youth, she often acted more like a caretaker than a carefree teenager. Christine, though more relaxed and easygoing, was not known to take unnecessary risks. Their sudden shift into excited behavior that afternoon was therefore unusual. Victimologists examining the case in modern times viewed this behavioral change as potentially significant. It could indicate that the girls were drawn toward something that, in that moment, felt safe, exciting, or trustworthy. If the girls willingly followed someone, it suggests that the offender may have possessed traits that made him appear harmless, someone youthful, charming, or socially confident. If they did not follow willingly, then something about the situation may have caused them to mask fear behind giggles, perhaps trying not to alarm the younger children. Unfortunately, without surviving witnesses from that moment, the true meaning of their behavior remains one of the most elusive aspects of the case. As investigators revisited old suspects, they were guided by both behavioral analysis and modern forensic logic. Some individuals, who had been considered peripheral in 1965, suddenly gained new significance under contemporary scrutiny. Others who once seemed compelling were later ruled out through alibi verification or biological elimination. Among the many persons of interest was the mysterious youth last seen with the girls. Cold case detectives pursued numerous leads regarding teenage boys who frequented the Cronulla area in the mid-1960s. They examined school enrollment records, surf clubs, local businesses, and social circles. They tracked down men who had lived in the area as teenagers, now elderly. They questioned some, eliminated others, and searched for any who might have left the country soon after the murders. Some leads produced potential names, others produced dead ends. By the 2010s, a new era of forensic science emerged. Low copy number DNA testing, enhanced microtrace recovery, mitochondrial DNA sequencing, and chemical analysis of aged fibers. These technologies opened new investigative paths previously unthinkable. Cold case units across the world were solving crimes older than the Wanda Beach murders. Families who had waited 50 or 60 years were receiving the answers they had long believed would never come. This surge in scientific progress allowed New South Wales investigators to revisit the girls' clothing once again. Specialists analyzed fabric fibers using high-resolution microscopes, ultraviolet imaging, and trace chemical mapping. Each test required extraordinary care. Old evidence can be unusually fragile. A single mishandling can compromise material that may be the last remaining link to the past. Though the results remain confidential, investigators have publicly stated that viable evidence may still exist on the clothing, that microscopic particles, fibers, or possibly even degraded biological traces could one day yield breakthroughs. This statement alone rekindled public interest and gave new hope to the families. But it also raised an emotional reality. Even if forensic science advances far enough to identify DNA, there is no guarantee the perpetrator would still be alive to face justice. Decades have passed. Many individuals who lived in Sydney in the 1960s are now elderly or have passed on. Identifying a suspect posthumously can bring answers, but it cannot bring accountability in the traditional sense. Still, for the families, truth itself is a form of justice. The Schmidt siblings, now older adults, have spoken about how deeply the tragedy impacted their lives. Peter, who was only 10 when he last saw his sister walking down the beach, carries a memory that remains vivid and painful. He remembers the wind. He remembers the towels wrapped around the younger children. He remembers the giggling, the odd, confusing giggling, and the moment the girls disappeared from sight. Those memories became lifelong companions, shaping the way he understood the world, relationships, and the fragility of life. He has also expressed frustration that early investigative leads were not pursued quickly enough, particularly in 1969, when a potential suspect was named. The delay in following up that lead still troubles him, not because he seeks someone to blame, but because it represents a moment where justice might have been within reach. Cold case detectives acknowledge this frustration. They know there were missed opportunities, not from lack of effort, but from limitations of the era. Limited communication between jurisdictions, slower information sharing, manual record keeping, and the absence of modern forensic tools. Yet, even with these challenges, the modern investigative team remained committed. They reviewed everything repeatedly. They consulted external experts. They reassessed behavioral patterns. They sought insights from forensic psychologists, criminologists, forensic anthropologists, and cold case analysts from around the world. Each specialist contributed a lens through which the events of that day could be reinterpreted. One of the most compelling modern interpretations focuses on the situational vulnerability of the girls that afternoon. The windstorm created chaos, reducing visibility, scattering sand, pushing beachgoers away. This unusual environment may have provided the offender with an opportunity that would not normally have existed. The dunes, partially emptied by the harsh wind, became a more secluded location than usual. People were moving quickly, shielding themselves, hurrying to leave. It was a moment of distraction that someone with predatory instincts could have exploited. Criminologists studying the case believe the offender may have been someone who recognized the shift in conditions and seized the moment, someone opportunistic, someone watching, someone who saw the sudden isolation created by the weather as a window of opportunity. But one of the most chilling aspects, one that cold case detectives have repeated over the decades, is how quickly the crime must have occurred. Investigators estimate that the girls were out of sight for a relatively short time before the younger children began walking back to the train station. For the offender to isolate them, force them into the dunes, and commit the crime within that time frame required a disturbing level of speed and determination. This is one of the reasons investigators believe the offender may have acted before and possibly after. Confidence of that magnitude seldom comes from someone who has never harmed before. It is rare for a person to commit a violent crime of this nature, impulsively, successfully, and without hesitation. That observation led cold case specialists to investigate known offenders operating in Australia in the mid-1960s, individuals linked to violent crimes, sexual assaults, or disturbing behaviors. Some names appeared repeatedly. Some were investigated and cleared. Others remained peripheral but suspicious, yet none could be conclusively tied to Wanda Beach. Still, hope remains not in speculation, but in science. Modern forensic technology has advanced at a breathtaking pace in recent years. Genetic genealogy, used to solve cold cases around the world, has become a revolutionary tool capable of identifying suspects using distant family lines. DNA that once seemed insignificant can now be used to build family trees and map ancestral connections. If any viable DNA exists on the girl's clothing, even degraded, partial, or fragmentary, it could, in time, lead to answers. The families know this, investigators know this, the public knows this. And it is why the Wanda Beach Murders remain so emotionally powerful even after nearly 6 decades, because the possibility for resolution still exists. Before moving on to Part 7, a reminder from Darkcasedesk. If these deep, narrative-style investigations matter to you, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps keep these important stories in the light. As the 2010s unfolded, public interest in cold cases surged like never before. Across the world, victims whose stories had been stuck in silence for decades suddenly became the focus of documentaries, podcasts, investigative series, and online communities dedicated to uncovering truth. In Australia, the Wanda Beach Murders were among the most frequently revisited. They were a case that refused to fade into history. They were a wound that had never healed, a question that had never been answered, and a story that demanded to be told again and again, not for sensationalism, but because 2 young girls deserved clarity. The renewed attention encouraged police to once more prioritize the case. Detectives returned to the evidence room, pulled out the same aging boxes that had been examined for more than half a century, and placed them on modern work tables under clean LED lights instead of the flickering fluorescence of the 1960s. The contrast between past and present was stark. The tools had changed. The world had changed. But the determination remained the same. When cold case investigators opened the boxes containing the girls' clothing, they handled each item with gloved care, aware that even the faintest trace could one day become meaningful through scientific breakthroughs. They analyzed stitching, examined tears, noted fabric stress, and documented the condition of the materials using high-resolution photography. These images were then compared with original photographs taken in 1965, allowing specialists to study how the years had affected the garments. Despite the decades that had passed, the clothes carried a haunting sense of immediacy. They were the final pieces of physical history left by Marianne and Christine, items that held memories of warm sun, shifting sand, laughter, and the final walk that changed everything. Cold case detectives often speak about the emotional impact of working with personal belongings of victims. Even after 50 years, touching the fabric felt like touching the final moment the girls were alive. As forensic teams continued their work, behavioral analysts re-examined the psychological dimensions of the case. They explored the profile of an offender who could have approached 2 teenage girls during daylight and convinced them either directly or indirectly to leave the safety of their younger siblings. Modern criminological theory emphasizes the importance of understanding offender motivations, behaviors, and patterns, even in cases where no physical evidence exists. In the Wanda Beach case, analysts came back repeatedly to the question of confidence. The crime was bold, committed in an environment where the perpetrator risked being seen by dozens of people. This suggested that the offender either had an extraordinary level of calm or moved with such natural ease that no one suspected a thing. Some experts have proposed that the offender may have been someone who blended seamlessly into the beach environment, possibly an older teenager or a young adult who did not draw attention. Beaches in the 1960s were filled with young men, surfing, sunbathing, or mingling with groups of friends. Someone in this demographic could easily have approached the girls without alarming anyone. Of course, this remains speculation. But behavioral analysis offers frameworks for understanding what type of individual could commit such a crime and disappear without a trace. Another aspect of the case that analysts revisited was the location of the crime. The dunes at Wanda Beach are known for their shifting shapes, tall grasses, and pockets of natural concealment. Investigators examined weather patterns, dune elevations, and sightlines from 1965 maps, The windstorm that afternoon may have contributed to lower visibility and fewer people lingering in certain areas. This environmental shift created a fleeting window of opportunity, one that someone with predatory instincts could have exploited. Criminologists studying the movements of predators often emphasize the role of opportunity. It may have been that the windstorm, which made the beach unpleasant for families, created a moment when the dunes were unusually quiet. This decrease in foot traffic could have allowed the offender to act quickly. It also could explain why so few witnesses recalled seeing anything that seemed suspicious. Still, even with this reasoning, one of the greatest puzzles remained. What made the girls leave so suddenly? Witnesses described them as giggling, excited. That behavior became central to understanding the psychological dynamic at play. Analysts offered several possible interpretations. Excitement could indicate they saw someone they knew. It could also be nervousness, laughter used to mask discomfort, an instinct to appear calm to the younger children. Alternatively, it could reflect the spontaneity of two 15-year-old girls who occasionally acted on impulse, despite generally being responsible. But without the girls' voices, these interpretations remain possibilities rather than answers. Throughout the 2010s, documentaries revisiting the Wanda Beach case featured interviews with former investigators, criminologists, and occasionally members of the public who had long followed the story. Many Australians who had been children or teenagers during the 1960s recounted how the case changed their perception of safety. Parents began monitoring their children more closely. Beaches, though still beloved, were no longer viewed with the same carefree innocence. The case represented a turning point, shaping the way communities thought about risk and vulnerability. For the Schmidt and Sherrock families, these renewed investigations brought hope, but also emotional strain. They had lived for decades with the weight of not knowing. Each time new developments were announced, memories resurfaced, stirring grief that had never fully settled. And yet, both families expressed tremendous gratitude toward investigators who refused to let the case disappear into silence. One particularly emotional moment came when cold case detectives formally contacted the surviving Schmidt siblings to inform them that the clothing was undergoing new scientific evaluation. Hearing that the garments still existed and were being handled with such care moved them deeply. Evidence from 1965 had somehow survived long enough to become relevant again. Cold case investigators often say that time is both an enemy and an ally. With time, evidence can degrade, witnesses can forget, and suspects can disappear. But time also brings new technology, new expertise, and new ways of thinking. What was once impossible can become possible decades later. One of the greatest examples of this is genetic genealogy, a method that has solved numerous cold cases in recent years. By analyzing DNA and comparing it to genealogical databases, investigators can map family trees and identify suspects based on distant relatives. This method does not require a direct DNA match. Even a small fragment can lead to clues. Cold case detectives in New South Wales acknowledged that if viable DNA could be recovered from the girls' clothing, even trace amounts, it might be possible to identify a suspect through genealogical analysis. This breakthrough, used extensively in the United States to solve cases from the 1970s and 80s, offered an entirely new path forward. But it also created a dilemma. Genetic genealogy requires cooperation, legal frameworks, and careful ethical considerations. It also requires the presence of DNA databases large enough to make familial matches possible. While Australia has embraced forensic innovation, genealogical databases have limitations compared to some other countries. Still, the hope remains and grows, with each passing year, that the Wanda Beach case may one day join the growing list of cold cases solved through cutting-edge science. As investigators continued their review, they also reflected on another element of the case: silence. Someone, somewhere, may know something. Perhaps a teenager present on the beach that day told a friend a story decades later. Perhaps a person overheard a comment, a confession, or a rumor. Perhaps someone who lived near the beach saw a strange interaction but convinced themselves it was unimportant. Silence has the power to bury truth, but truth also has a way of resurfacing, especially when stories remain alive in the public consciousness. And that is why telling the story matters. Why remembering the girls matters. Why keeping the case in the light matters. Because truth often reveals itself slowly, across time, through persistence, awareness, and curiosity. Marianne and Christine were not just victims of a tragic crime. They were daughters, sisters, friends, classmates. They were young women with dreams, with futures ahead of them. Their laughter on that windy afternoon was real, their friendship was real, their humanity must remain at the center of their story. As we move deeper into this documentary narrative toward the emotional aftermath, the investigative re-evaluations of the 2020s, and the enduring legacy of the case, remember that these stories are not simply mysteries. They are reminders of the lives that were lived, the families that were changed forever, and the countless investigators who refused to let their memory be forgotten. Before continuing, a gentle reminder from Darkcasedesk. If you're finding value in these long-form investigations, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps keep important stories alive and ensures victims like Marianne and Christine remain remembered. As the 2020s progressed, the Wanda Beach murders stood on the threshold between history and possibility. An old story, still pulsing with the potential for resolution. Though more than half a century had passed, the case had never slipped into obscurity. It remained one of the most discussed, most analyzed, and most emotionally charged unsolved crimes in Australian history. And in many ways, the modern era breathed new life into the pursuit of truth. One of the profound shifts in recent years has been a greater public understanding of cold case investigations. The public has grown familiar with the language of forensic science, genetic genealogy, behavioral profiling, and investigative reconstruction. People have become more aware of the fragility of evidence, the importance of timelines, and the emotional weight detectives carry. Because of this collective understanding, cases like the Wanda Beach murders no longer exist solely in dusty police files. They live in cultural memory, shaped and reshaped by each new generation of storytellers, investigators, and families who refuse to forget. For modern investigators, the case carries a deeply human element. Even those who were not alive in 1965 speak about Marianne and Christine as though they know them. They have read their school records, studied their photographs, memorized their daily routines, and tried to imagine the laughter of two teenage girls on a summer day. Investigators grow protective of victims in cold cases. They feel responsible not only for solving the case, but for preserving the dignity of the victims themselves. This emotional connection is especially true in the Wanda Beach case, where the victims were so young and the circumstances so abrupt. Marianne and Christine were not living risk-filled lives. They were normal teenagers on a school holiday, taking their siblings to the beach, doing everything right. Their story is not one of recklessness, but of innocence. And that innocence is what fuels the passion of those who continue to investigate. Cold case analysts in the 2020s also revisited a central question: who would have approached two teenage girls in broad daylight on a public beach, and what traits would such an offender possess? Modern behavioral science suggested that the perpetrator likely had a high degree of social confidence, someone who could make the girls feel at ease, or at least calm enough for them to walk away from their siblings. Someone who could suppress suspicion. Someone who might have appeared unremarkable, blending easily with the surroundings. Investigators also studied the specific environment of the crime. The dunes at Wanda Beach are not random. They form a complex natural structure of ridges and hollows, places that shift with wind patterns and erosion. In 1965, these dunes were taller, looser, and more isolated. The strong afternoon winds that day created an unusual level of concealment. Sand moved in great sweeping clouds, visibility dropped, and families left early because the wind made the beach uncomfortable. The very weather that should have signaled a difficult beach day may have created the conditions necessary for the crime to occur unnoticed. Geographical profilers believed that the offender may have watched the girls first. Predators often observe before they act, particularly in public spaces. This could explain the girls' sudden behavioral change. Someone might have approached them earlier, engaged them briefly, then waited for the right moment. Or, the approach may have been immediate and unexpected. The psychological profiles built in the 2020s aligned with what criminologists refer to as an opportunistic yet practiced offender, someone who seized an unexpected chance but acted with disturbing efficiency. Cold case detectives studying the timeline estimated that from the moment the girls left the younger children to the moment the siblings began walking away, the window of opportunity was relatively narrow. This suggested several things. First, the offender may have moved quickly and decisively. Second, the girls might have felt a level of familiarity or safety that allowed them to enter the dunes without hesitation. Third, the offender likely had a plan, or at least a behavioral pattern that allowed for rapid action. These observations, while not definitive, were essential to understanding the psychology behind the case. Meanwhile, advances in forensic science continued to develop rapidly. Techniques that once seemed futuristic were becoming standard practice. Microtrace recovery could now pick up particles smaller than a grain of dust. Mitochondrial DNA testing allowed scientists to extract genetic information even when nuclear DNA was degraded. Enhanced imaging techniques revealed fibers invisible to the naked eye. Police laboratories across Australia invested in high-grade equipment designed specifically for cold case work. The Wanda Beach garments, carefully preserved for decades, were examined with greater precision than ever before. Though authorities did not publicly release detailed findings, they confirmed that forensic evaluation remained active and ongoing. One of the emotional complexities of this stage of the investigation was managing public expectation. In the age of instant updates, people wanted answers quickly. But forensic testing is slow and methodical, especially with fragile evidence. Detectives were careful to balance hope with realism. They knew the possibility of DNA recovery existed, but they also acknowledged the uncertainty that comes with evidence aged more than 50 years. Another modern challenge was the gradual loss of witnesses. As time passes, key individuals age, memories fade, and opportunities for re-interview diminish. Some people who were teenagers in 1965 are now in their 70s or 80s. Some witnesses have passed away. Others may have spoken to friends or family about what they saw, but never to police. Collecting these secondary memories, rumors, confessions, or suspicions shared privately became another tool for investigators. Interestingly, cold case detectives discovered that, as people aged, some became more willing to share details they once withheld. What seemed insignificant in adolescence may feel important in later life. What once felt frightening to admit might now feel like a moral obligation. These late-life conversations contributed subtle but meaningful insights into the social atmosphere and interpersonal dynamics of the day. Another important modern development was the application of contemporary offender databases. Investigators cross-referenced individuals known to exhibit violent behavior in the decades following the crime. They analyzed patterns, routes, criminal progression, and geographical movements. Some suspects from the past were re-evaluated. Others were eliminated through DNA comparisons in unrelated cases. Still, others remained persons of interest unconfirmed but not dismissed. One concept that became significant in the 2020s is known as behavioral drift. This refers to how offenders' behaviors evolve over time. If the Wanda Beach murderer continued offending in later years, his patterns may have shifted. Perhaps he became more brazen. Perhaps he changed locations. Perhaps he refined his methods. Studying cases from the late 60s, 70s, and even 80s allowed investigators to see whether any offenders showed characteristics consistent with what might have happened at Wanda. Still, despite this enormous analytical effort, no definitive suspect has been conclusively identified. But this lack of certainty does not mean the case is unsolvable. It simply means the investigation remains active, waiting for the right piece of information, the right technological advancement, or the right genetic clue to bring clarity. Throughout all these years, the most powerful motivator has been the families. The surviving Schmidt siblings have spoken publicly about the impact of losing Marianne. They remember her as a gentle leader among them, someone who helped their mother, someone who protected them. Their memories of her are warm but sharp, filled with love, but also with the lingering pain of how suddenly she was taken. They want to understand what happened. They want to know why. They want to honor her memory with truth. The Sherrock family has likewise carried Christine's memory through generations. Her siblings speak about her kindness, her intelligence, and her potential. They imagine the life she might have lived, the relationship she might have built, the family she might have had, the career she might have pursued. Christine's story is a reminder of the future stolen when crimes like this occur. Cold case detectives, criminologists, and forensic scientists often speak about the emotional connection they develop with victims in long-term cases. In the Wanda Beach investigation, this connection is profound. Investigators describe feeling a deep sense of duty, one not just rooted in professional responsibility, but in personal compassion. They want answers not simply because it is their job, but because the girls deserve justice. The possibility of resolution remains. DNA technology continues to evolve. Genealogical research continues to expand. Forensic methods grow more advanced with each passing year. And the preserved garments, those last remaining physical ties to the girls, still carry the potential to reveal truth. What investigators know is this: the story is not over. Not until every avenue has been exhausted. Not until science has given everything it can. Not until truth is uncovered. Before moving to the final part of this 20,000-word documentary, a reminder from Darkcasedesk. If these deep investigative narratives matter to you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps keep forgotten cases alive. ensuring victims like Marianne and Christine are never lost to time. As the investigation entered its most modern era, the Wanda Beach murders stood as one of the longest-lasting mysteries in Australian history. After nearly 6 decades, the case had moved beyond a simple police file. It had become a symbol of persistence, of heartbreak, of the limits of forensic science, and the astonishing possibilities that new technology brings. It was a case that lived in the space between uncertainty and hope. For investigators, the modern phase of the Wanda Beach case required a delicate balance of scientific precision, historical understanding, and emotional awareness. They were not only dealing with the past, they were dealing with living people, families still carrying the impact, and a public that had watched the story evolve over generations. Cold case detectives often talk about the emotional toll these cases take on them. When they immerse themselves in the investigation, they read every page of every report, examine every photograph, and discuss every detail until the past becomes present. They learn the victims' personalities, voices, and lives. They walk with them, in a sense, through their final hours. They see the tragedy unfold in their minds thousands of times. And with the Wanda Beach case, that emotional weight is multiplied by time. More than half a century of grief, more than half a century of unanswered questions, and more than half a century of families holding on to hope. In the final phase of the investigation, detectives and forensic specialists focused on what remained physically of that day: the girls' clothing. These garments, stored in archival boxes for decades, held a paradox. They were fragile, yet they were the strongest remaining link to the truth. Every fiber of fabric was examined with cutting-edge technology. Every thread was scanned, illuminated, and analyzed with tools that did not exist even 10 years ago. Specialists sought microscopic traces, tiny fragments of biological material, particles shed by skin cells, chemical signatures left by contact. Even a single viable molecule could hold enough information to reveal a fragment of truth. Forensic teams treated the garments as if they were sacred artifacts, because in many ways, they were. They represented the girls' final moments. They represented the hope that science could illuminate what human memory could no longer hold. But as advanced as forensic science has become, it still faces limitations. Evidence from 1965 has endured wind, moisture, handling, environmental wear, and natural degradation. Cold case investigators know that even with the best technology in the world, not every case can be solved through DNA alone. Yet they also know that science continues to evolve. What may not be possible today could easily become possible tomorrow. This is why the Wanda Beach case remains open, not just on paper, but in spirit. Investigators understand that the answers might still come. They know that in other decades-old cases, breakthroughs have occurred when least expected. They know that technology often moves in leaps, not small steps. They are ready for the moment when the right tool, the right advancement, or the right discovery makes the impossible suddenly clear. As forensic efforts continued, investigators also reflected on the human element of the case, the emotional truth hidden within memories, conversations, and private recollections. Stories surfaced from people who had grown up near the beach. Some remembered strange men who lingered too long, or unusual behavior from neighbors. Others remembered rumors that circulated in the weeks after the murders. Some individuals recalled conversations they overheard as teenagers but never understood until years later. These accounts were not concrete evidence, but they added texture to the investigative timeline. They helped detectives understand the social landscape of the 1960s, the dynamics, the fears, the voices that shaped how people perceived danger at that time. In the 2020s, investigators also recognized the importance of public awareness in solving cold cases. Modern communities have become powerful allies in investigations. People share archived stories, analyze timelines, and spread information across social platforms. While police work cannot rely solely on the public, awareness often encourages witnesses to come forward even years or decades after the fact. For the Wanda Beach case, this public involvement has kept the story alive. It has ensured that Marianne and Christine are not forgotten. It has protected their memory from fading into the background of history. And it has given new generations the opportunity to understand the tragedy, the importance of vigilance, and the humanity of the victims. But perhaps the deepest emotional dimension of the modern investigation lies with the families themselves. For the Schmidt family, the tragedy was compounded by earlier loss. Marianne had taken on the role of caretaker after the death of their father. She was a second mother to her younger siblings, a source of comfort and stability in a home filled with grief. Losing her not only broke the hearts of her siblings, it fractured the structure of their world. In interviews, they have spoken with honesty about how deeply the loss shaped them. They grew up with shadows at their heels. Every joyful moment carried a quiet echo of what was missing. For the Sherrock family, the loss of Christine was equally devastating. She was a bright, gentle girl who loved her friends and family. Her siblings grew up without the older sister who would have guided them, laughed with them, and shared life with them. Her parents carried a sadness that never left them, one that no amount of time could ease. Cold case investigators understand that closure, if it comes, will not erase grief. It will not restore the lives that were taken, but it will bring clarity, a sense of understanding that the families have lacked for so long. One of the most powerful truths in this story is that justice is not always about punishment. Justice is also about truth. Justice is about knowing what happened. Justice is about giving a voice to victims who can no longer speak. Even if the perpetrator cannot be prosecuted because of death, or age, or time, the truth still matters. The truth itself is a form of justice. As we enter the final reflections of this narrative, it becomes clear that the Wanda Beach murders are more than a cold case. They are a reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly innocence can be shattered, and how deeply tragedy can shape a nation. They are also a reminder of persistence, of investigators who refuse to abandon hope, of families who refuse to stop searching, and of communities who refuse to let memory fade. In telling this story, we honor Marianne and Christine. We honor the families who carry their memories. We honor the investigators who devoted their careers to seeking truth. And we honor the future possibility that science may one day provide the answers that the past could not. As we close this 20,000-word documentary narrative, we return one final time to that windy summer afternoon in January of 1965. Two teenage girls walked down the beach, laughing just for a moment, leaving behind the responsibilities they carried. They walked toward the dunes, unaware that the world was about to change forever. Their lives were taken, but their story remains. And as long as it remains alive, there is still hope. Before we end, a final message from darkcasedesk. If this deep, long-form investigation has meant something to you, if you believe in keeping these cases in the light, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps ensure that victims like Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sherrock are never forgotten, and that their story continues to be told until the truth finally comes to light. Thank you for staying with this entire documentary.